Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Claudia Rowe, the author of Wards of the State, The Long Shadow of American Foster Care. This is her third book. She's been published in the New York Times, the Seattle Times, and has been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize twice. Thanks so much for being here, Claudia.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be with you today.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. You and I are both reporters, Claudia, so I want to start with a story that I covered and became attached to, as sometimes happens. With the hundreds of stories that I cover every year, I find that I most often get emotionally invested in stories that involve children. A few years ago, I did a story about the arrest of a 44-year-old man who killed a 14-year-old girl in the middle of the night on an abandoned street after picking her up in his car. It turns out the motive, as was revealed in court later, was over her sexual history, which is not an easy detail for anybody to hear, particularly about a 14-year-old girl. It turns out, according to her adoptive mother, who we spoke to before and after the court case, she was a runaway who often had mental health issues and who seemed to be obsessed with the idea of finding her birth parents. No matter what her adoptive mother did, she could not satiate her daughter's obsession. So she would leave the house at all hours to wander. And I would later learn that she'd been in several foster homes the first few years of her life. And your book starts with a teen who's on the other end of that gun, who actually pulls the trigger and kills somebody. And so I'm just curious, you say behavior is a language. It's probably true for all kids, but why especially for foster children?
It's definitely true for all kids, and the teacher who said that to me was referring. It's a teacher who made that comment to me initially, and she was referring to all kids. She was referring, frankly, to school discipline. But what you've described in that story fascinates me because it's so in line with everything I found researching this book over the past 5 or 6 years. Um, So, most foster kids who are not adopted by the time they are adolescents have a run history. The kids tend to run, and they run from adoptive homes and they run from foster homes. And it's not because generally, it's just as you say, it's generally not because of abuse in the foster home. It is, I mean, that happens, but that's not the primary reason. The primary reason is kids are running towards something. They are looking for something. They are looking often for their birth parents, even if those birth parents neglected them, even if they attempted to kill them, as I have a sort of an allusion to such an instance in Wards of the State. Or, as is more common, if those birth parents neglected them, were drug addicted, eventually lost their rights, their parental rights. Still, foster kids run and they're looking for their parents on the street. They're also looking for other kids on the street, kids who get them, who sort of understand what it is to be a foster kid.
So you've heard that before, and I'm curious, are they literally looking for them, or are they doing what they think is looking for the parents, or is it this sort of idea that they're chasing?
I think both. Um, I mean, I referenced two instances of kids in the book I wrote doing exactly that. One is the sort of opening character. Her name is Marianne, and she's the teenager you just referenced who shot a man in the head when she was out on the street very, very late at night in Seattle. Um, she was constantly looking on the street for her mom. She was also constantly looking for other kids who were essentially for her kind of like a family. This is, I would say, not super conscious, more of an unconscious drive, which is, I think, what you're getting at. For the other youth in the book who was doing that. He's an older person now in his 50s. His mom had tried to stab him to death, and that's what resulted in his removal from her care and his placement in foster care. And yet he still was a chronic runner, always looking for her on the streets. Is it like a planned, I'll find them and this is where I'll look and then this will happen? Probably not. These are young people acting
Yeah.
often on impulse, but yeah, the
Before we
impulse
go
is there.
further, I do want to mention that axelbankhistory.com was designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. It has our most recent episodes on it. It has featured episodes and also a link to that Patreon page that I mentioned. So definitely check her work out. One statistic, Claudia, from your book absolutely stunned me, which is that 1/4 of prison inmates spend at least some part of their childhood as foster children. Are there any other such sizable contributing factors to a difficult life that get such little attention? I mean, people mention poverty, they mention being surrounded in a neighborhood with crime, difficult schools, but you never hear what about the foster kids?
Exactly. Foster kids are essentially invisible, and this is not an accident. Because they are minors, the state very conveniently says we have to protect their privacy, we have to protect confidentiality. They're minors. We're acting in loco parentis as their parents. We've removed them. This is how we're protecting them. But of course, since nobody knows which kid is a foster kid in general, it's very difficult for outsiders, say reporters like you and I, to really scrutinize what is happening to kids in foster care. So this protection of privacy and confidentiality really is only a protection for the state. It is the state that is mandating that they would be invisible, really, to sort of the general public. This is why I wrote this book. I really think that it's important to see foster kids. They do have some particular needs that are not insurmountable, but they are invisible in many cases to those outside of the system.
One thing that stunned me also, well, one thing, I guess we're up to the second thing. The threat of child removal is actually quite common in America and in American history. So explain that. And I'm also curious what history there is to the foster system. How did this all start?
Right. So this all started in the second half of the 19th century. So roughly the 1850s and 60s, when New York City, primarily, the streets of the city were just flooded with kids living on the streets, sort of akin, and people were outraged, right? Like horrified by the sight, tens of thousands of destitute children living on the streets, similar to what we would say today about, say, homeless people, frankly, in Seattle, which has a serious problem with homelessness, many other cities as well. The kind of sort of public outcry and hand wringing and desperate search for solutions that we see today regarding homelessness was happening sort of among I don't know, the wealthier classes of New York City, sort of what we disparagingly refer to as do-gooders. But there was a man, Charles Loring Brace. He had been educated at Yale. He was an affluent young man, a minister, who was horrified by all these kids on the streets in New York City, literally sleeping on the streets, banding together in gangs, stealing from people, crime related, all the stuff, all the same stuff that we see today. And he said, hey, what if we took all these kids and there are all these farms, in burgeoning new America, farms in the West who need help on the farms? What if we remove these kids from the mean streets of New York City and we send them out to these farmers and they'll get room and board and kind of maybe they'll work. That
No,
whole child
help out in
labor
the
part was
field.
quite vague.
Right.
But it was, oh, it'll be a win-win. There was not money involved at this point, but it is the start of a concept about taking kids in need and plunking them down in families. That, 50 years later, so then, there were well over 100,000 kids transferred out of New York City onto these farms. Many of them, in fact, had parents, but they are sort of popularly known as the orphan train movement. This went into the 20th century to roughly 1929 is the rough sort of last train load of kids. And then around that point, the US government is starting to give these widow stipends, which looks more like what we see in foster care today. They were trying to help families, primarily single moms, with government support. But those were single moms caring for their own children. And then in 1961, after various southern states have passed laws prohibiting Black moms from getting this government aid, Arthur Fleming, who works for for the U.S. government, for the federal government, says, "Hey, if we deem these certain families, primarily Black families led by single moms, if we deem them, unsuitable for benefits, how can we leave kids with them? That doesn't make any sense. We have to remove the kids." And that touches off this enormous increase in kids being so-called parented by the state.
And does every state establish one? I would imagine all 50 states have some kind of a system, but it's only been established, and you're saying the 60s. We're talking of only about 60 years of this system.
Oh, I see. You're talking about the 1961, right? That's roughly, foster care as we know it is roughly a century old, the government giving some kind of support to help families care for kids. But yes, the way we see it today starts in 1961.
And what did you mean when you say in the book that the threat of child removal is actually something that's quite common in this country, or on the land that this country is now situated on?
Well, it depends which people you're talking about. I'll just say right out, they're like no middle class kids in foster care. So the threat of child removal is very real if you are poor. It's even realer if you are Black or Latino. But Black children are overrepresented in foster care in terms of their rate in the overall U.S. youth population. They're much higher, much more represented in foster care. So they're roughly like 14% of the US youth population, and they are roughly 23 to 28% of the foster care population. So they are overrepresented in foster care. And the data that I found showed that I think it's more than half, I think it's 53% of all Black youth will have been the subject of a Child Protective Services investigation by the time they're 18. So Black families under the microscope more than really any other group. Except for Native American families. They are even more.
What are the essentials to understanding how this system is set up, just so we can understand like what ground we're playing on here? So if you could take whatever the prototypical child is, and of course that doesn't exist, but if you could just sort of put all the data into one kid, and there's no apparent legal guardian left standing, or the guardians are in trouble, who decides where they go and where they get sent?
So the primary reason that children are taken into foster care is not abuse, nor is it sexual abuse. It's neglect. So basically but neglect and poverty often look the same. So say a child shows up at school, they're wearing the same clothes for 2 weeks, they don't have enough food at lunchtime. A teacher or some other person in the building might pick up the phone and call the state, whatever state. They call
And in some states, it's the law.
Mandatory reporters. Yeah, teachers are mandatory reporters. So they'll call CPS and they'll say, it looks like Mary might be not being cared for by her parent. And that will touch off sort of a series of, like a flow chart, a series of questions from CPS, Child Protective Services, trying to ascertain whether to go in and go into that home and investigate in more detail. The thing is, these are humans, these are not machines making these determinations, and it's different state to state because people are different. So what might look in some states might seem to an intake person, oh, this is a family in poverty. In another state might look like reason for removal, might look like, criminal neglect. The problem is poverty and neglect overlap, as do neglect and mental illness. All of these things kind of overlap one another. Teasing them apart to know what's best to keep a child safe is really difficult. I don't want readers of this book to think, which is very critical of foster care, to think I believe that there's a villain and there's an easy fix. There's not a villain here. We've inherited a system. I guess I would say the only villain is our state of mind. We've inherited a system that's existed roughly, depending on how you want to count, roughly for a century, give or take. But we've learned a great deal more about brain development and child development in the last 20 years. And we have not realigned the foster care system to take that brain development into account. We still operate in a way that is bad for kids' brain development.
You mentioned that there is no villain in the book, and I get that. However, I'm reminded here, just sitting here, I didn't think of it till this moment. I covered a story once, and I honestly don't remember what happened, but I believe it ended in the death of a child. And so the whatever county it was in Florida, basically offered a press conference to talk about this child. And I asked, will you resign given what has happened? In other words, is the leadership here capable of running this system given that this child, without any dispute, this is what happened? He fell through the cracks and wound up in the wrong place and died.
In
And they,
foster care, he was killed
yeah,
in
oh yeah,
foster
yeah,
care.
in foster care, and they were enormously offended at the question to the point where they called afterwards and and asked me not to use whatever the response was, and it was over 10 years ago. I don't remember the details of it. But it struck me that you say in the book that the state is not legally responsible for what happens to the kids. So that reaction that I got is part of this concept you're talking about, that while there's no villain, the state is still not legally responsible here.
Uh, there's an important qualifier. The state is legally responsible if the child is harmed while in their placement. So you could be in foster care, but like the young people we discussed at the beginning of this interview, you run from your placement. If you are on the run, or what they call missing from care, if you're not where you're assigned, you're not at your assigned family home, then the state is not responsible. So you know, they're responsible if you are in the place that they've put you. But this is really, fuzzy stuff. I mean, look, the kid runs from placement, and the government has said, we are the parent. We're the parent. Now, you have to look in the broader society. We don't actually hold parents, biological parents, responsible all the time for crimes their kids may commit. Like in the case of the Crumley family in the Midwest, which was a year or two ago, these two parents are being held criminally liable for their child. I think his name is Ethan Crumley, shot kids at school, and the parents knew he had a gun and they knew he had mental health problems. These two parents, this mom and dad, are being held criminally responsible by the courts. And it's a massive story because it's so unusual. That's why we traditionally have not done that. But we kind of expect, if the government is going to remove a child and the government says, hey, we can do better by this kid, we can keep them safer than their own biological family is able to. The government's promise is, you're at risk at home. You will be safe if we take you. And that promise is often not borne out.
And how would that responsibility bear itself out? Would it be a lawsuit by somebody?
Yeah,
If yeah,
there are bajillions of dollars in lawsuits every year, pretty much in every state in this country, against the child welfare
yeah.
system for failures of child welfare.
So, what are the goals here of the foster care system? Like, what is the intention for where the kids will wind up? And are those goals and intentions clear?
The stated goal of the foster care system is permanence. And that means you are either adopted or reunited with your biological family. This is the stated goal of foster care. The structure of the system, however, is impermanence. It's transience. It's kids moving from one foster home to another, to another, to another. Because if that foster home isn't going to adopt you, you're moving on because we want you adopted. But if a kid is not adopted by the age of roughly 12 right before they're a teenager. It's very unlikely that they will be because adoptive families want young children. So kids who are not adopted by the time of their adolescence tend to end up in group homes. And group homes, there are, like four paths that sort of push kids toward incarceration. You mentioned 25% of inmates in state prisons are believed to be alumni of the foster care system. This is how. There are four paths. Running away is one of them because the cops pick you up and they put you in juvie. You're then locked up. Or you're in a group home, and group homes tend to be very violent, and kids assault one another or they assault staff, and staff call the police. Police come, they put you in juvie. These are two ways you've just been locked up, and the numbers are pretty extreme. Like really deep, long, longitudinal research has found that roughly 59% of kids who age out of foster care at 18 will have been locked up somewhere by the time they're 26. Kids in juvie, while they're still teenagers in foster care, is part of that number.
Wow.
That's a huge driver of that 59%. But still, 59%? This is supposed to be a safer system than growing up at home? This is
Yeah.
terrible.
uh, Early on in the book, as I mentioned, you bring up the story, or you open the book with the story of a 16-year-old who was charged with murder. I mentioned her at the beginning. The case is fascinating because the defense blamed the same people who employ the prosecutors, basically the state, for leaving the child in a position where she was looking to rob someone. How did you feel sitting in that courtroom watching a 19-year-old who was a victim of so much become the accused?
Hmm. Interesting question. I had covered a lot of juvenile crime as a reporter. I've been a reporter for 34 years, and this case sort of landed in front of me in 2019. And I had covered a lot of juvenile justice stories, a lot of gang crime, youth crime, and I had covered intermittently the foster care system, but not until I saw them in sort of combined in this case did the lights come on for me. So, what did I think watching this young woman? She committed her crime at 16. It took all that time for her to land in front of a judge at 19. She sat in juvenile detention for 2 years, then she was moved to the county jail, and now finally, 3 years later, she was in front of a judge for sentencing. I was really intrigued, as you mentioned. Her defense said the foster care system was at least partly culpable for what she had done. It had shaped her mentality, her experience, her impulsivity. It was partly to blame for what she had done. That argument was unsuccessful. She got a 19-year sentence, but it intrigued me a great deal because it was bringing together these sort of disparate systems that really aren't separate, but that are covered by reporters separately. And they all combined in the story of this one young girl. So I was really kind of galvanized to run it down and first find out, is this an aberration? Is she some sort of extreme? And what I found out was that Marianne was not at all. Her act, her crime, of course, is extreme. Not every foster kid on the run is going to shoot someone in the head. However, her path to that point was totally typical, like a half dozen placements, an adoption that failed, chronic running on the street. It was standard stuff.
Where were her records gettable under public records law, or did you have to literally find the people and interview them?
Both. First, she had to give me permission.
Oh,
So
okay. Yeah.
she wanted her story
I,
told.
yeah.
Marianne and every other young person in this book spoke to me not because they had anything to gain. There's no money exchange. There is nothing they had to gain, really, except they desperately, desperately wanted their stories told. And it brings me in mind of the comment at the beginning. We talked about how invisible foster kids are. The state wants them shielded from scrutiny. They don't want to be shielded. Not the ones I spoke to, desperately want to be seen. And Marianne did too.
So one of my favorite questions that I get from young reporters or from interns is, how do you find the people you talk to? And I don't always have a great answer for them. You just kind of find them. But I'm sure there are, in this case, you know exactly how you found them. How did you find the other subjects of the book? I mean, okay, the court case is one thing. She's sitting there in court, but you found a kid sleeping on the New York City subways. You found, as you describe, a gangbanger turned grad student. and also a foster child who now works in the White House. How did you find them? What made you say, I know where to look for them?
Not exactly like that. What I did, it was the book is structured kind of as like unraveling a mystery, really. And the mystery was, what is this number of 59% experiencing some kind of lockup? A system that we said is supposed to save kids, in fact, is channeling 59% of them into some kind of locked cell at some point. That number, I knew that number when it came out in the research in 2008, maybe. It had sort of jangled around in my mind. And then here was Marianne in front of me in this court case. So the first thing was to find out, what, like I said, is she sort of unusual in any way? And then I found these sort of four paths that lead kids to being part of that number, that 59%. Like I said, running away, group homes, also broken adoptions, which Marianne experienced, and aging out at 18 without support. Kids are 18 and the government goes, happy birthday, goodbye, we're done. And the foster parents tend to be like, well, we're not getting any government support anymore for you.
Mm.
They get a monthly check and they're like, good luck to you, goodbye. And kids literally walk out the door with their stuff in a garbage bag off onto the streets. And no
Literally at
wonder
18.
yeah, and no wonder tens of thousands of kids leaving the system are immediately homeless. They don't have anything in the way of job skills. They have very spotty educations because they've moved around. Half of them drop out of high school before earning a diploma, and their own biological families are generally in no position to help them out. So, what do you think is going to happen? And this has been known for quite a while. And yet, there isn't just massive outcry from the general public. We have this invisible system of kids, but we have this incredibly visible system of mass incarceration and homelessness that we all wring our hands over every day and are in the newspapers every day. And we have not recognized that foster care is a driver of those systems. This is what I wanted to show. And how I found the kids was reporting out each of these four prongs. And in running down what happens when kids run away, what happens in group homes, what happens in broken adoptions, what happens in aging out, in reporting out each of those phenomena, I found my kids.
Yeah, through the groups that study those four prongs.
Not so much. Through, like you said, you just do it as a reporter. I mean, you're not gonna, I certainly am not gonna have some group hand me, oh,
Yeah,
here's a good kid to study. None of that.
yeah, yeah,
None of that. I mean, you find them, you're out there, you're doing it. The first one is, I mean, I can tell you how the first one came about because he led to the next. I
yeah.
mean, the first one was when I'm trying to figure out what is this nexus of foster youth and incarceration. And I'm just sort of in my office doing my thing, talking to people. And a guy who had been formerly incarcerated said, oh, that's what you're looking at? You need to talk to Art Longworth, who was a guy doing a life sentence in Max prison who had been cut from foster care, dumped on the streets of Seattle in the early 1980s. And he recognized the same thing in prison on his own that was like gelling in my own mind. He saw all these other inmates around him and he realized, oh, I know them all from foster care. I know them all from growing up in group homes, or these are the kids I knew of the men who were with me in group homes. And he was researching this same question. How is it that everyone around me was from foster care? And so Art and I matched up, you know?
So how do you, once you have the kids and the personal stories, what did you do to then build the larger story, the larger case with, as I mentioned, the studies, the public record, the newspaper articles? What was your strategy to build out, to take these personal stories and find the larger theme and thread?
Um, I appreciate this question, which is very much sort of a writing process question. I don't always get to talk about that. Um,
I do ask the writing process questions here.
for those who are wondering, yes. When I had the idea for this book, my original inspiration, what I really wanted to do was convey sort of the psychological experience of being a foster care? What does it feel like when you're just sort of moved from home to home? You're always the new kid in school at the next home, right? Or you're always a stranger, you're disconnected. Um, what does that actually feel like? What does it feel like to be 14 years old and on the street at 2 a.m. because you're run from your placement? Like, what is that head? I really wanted to tell this through the eyes of the kids. And that is the first draft that I turned in. I turned in this very sort of through their eyes pastiche of these six young people and how they had navigated the system. And my editor said, well, that's fantastic. We feel the kids, we see the kids, but where is the connective tissue? How did they get to be in these places? What is the history? What are the laws? What is the sort of context in which these stories happen? And so then I went back. Of course, all of that stuff I knew. What was harder was really getting into kids' heads and getting them to trust me. And that took years. But all the stuff about laws, legal research, that was easier because that is the stuff of reporting. I mean, we know that it's out there.
How
It's easier.
how much of a challenge was it to study, or is it to study something that is not centrally located? In other words, I do a show with an Abraham Lincoln author, and there are a few places that Lincoln's papers are. There are some other people who they say, okay, I need to study this guy's papers. I need to go into the National Archives for this. This is not a centrally located thing. There are 50 states, probably with many legs of the system in each one. Many of the records only become public if a child dies. And there's also great shame over this system too, from many different angles of it. So how did you even study this, given that it's in so many places?
That's a fantastic question. And you're right, it's all over the place. There are a few sort of central major foundations that study foster care. Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago is like a think tank that has been doing sort of deep research on homeless youth and foster youth for decades. They are the first people who had the studies that showed 59% ending up locked up when they age out of foster care. So Chapin Hall, I knew as a reporter. I didn't sort of knock on their door and say, "Hey, I'm doing a book. Can you help me out?" You don't really. I don't know. That's not how I do it. I more I guess I would say it was a combination. It's not as clean as, first find the kids, then the research, or vice versa. Get all the research, then find the kids. It's kind of all happening at the same time. I'm learning about, for instance, from Art Longworth, this guy who was locked up in Max, and recognizing this phenomenon. Art had spent virtually all of his time in foster care in group homes. That's what made me know, oh, you got to go run down group homes. You got to find all the research on group homes. You got to understand what happens to kids in group homes. And in doing that, I found Sixto Cancel, who was at that time a young activist, had been in foster care, and he was just completing a massive report on group homes. So connecting to with Sixto, who had a very different path and is the person who has worked with three presidential administrations. He did not end up in prison, but he had a rough enough time in foster care that he was inspired to essentially devote his life to changing the system through activism. And that is what he's doing. Still super young. I don't even know if he's 35 yet. Incredibly galvanizing force. Through Sixto's work on group homes, I mean, it's really not as impenetrable as it might sound. There's tons of research out there, and thank goodness for the internet for this one thing. The
Yeah.
availability of connecting, I mean, the ease of connecting with people and research is just vastly different than it would have been,
Yeah.
20, 25 years ago.
It is quite clear that you are as good of a reporter as there probably is in this country. Very few of us will attain what you have attained, both in ability and in terms of results. I'm really curious, though. Not all reporters start out the way you are now. We all try hard for a long time to get somewhat good at what we do. I'm curious. What did you spend the early part of your journalism career doing? How did this all start for you?
Thanks for the question. I'm a New York City native.
Oh, me too. You
I
see my
know.
Mets and Rangers stuff over
I
here?
know you are.
Yeah,
Okay,
okay.
so born and raised in New York City, and my first journalism
Like
job
Manhattan,
was
sorry, like Manhattan or
Uh-huh.
Bronx or yeah, okay, yeah.
I was born and raised in Manhattan. Think I've lived in every borough except Staten Island. So my first job in journalism was at a weekly newspaper in the Bronx. It's
Huh.
called the Riverdale Press.
Oh, I mean, I've been in the Riverdale Press several times. My dad has been in it like 500 times. So,
It was a great place to start. I will tell you for total transparency and honesty, when I got out of college, I was done with school. I was not interested. I went to a tiny, tiny, tiny liberal arts college. We did not have a journalism major, and I was like, no, I'm not going to go to journalism school. I'm done with school. I'm not going to go to J school. So I was insistent that I would find a job in journalism without J school. And the Riverdale Press was my J school. They were fantastic. And they took, they saw whatever they saw in me. These are funny stories about how I got that job. But they essentially acted as my journalism school. From there, I went to a small daily paper in the Hudson Valley called the Poughkeepsie Journal in Poughkeepsie, New York. And after the Journal, I frankly became quite disillusioned with journalism and said, forget it, I'm out, I'm done. And I thought I didn't really know what I was going to do, but one thing led to another. I ended up freelancing a lot for the New York Times. I ended up being kind of like a regular stringer for the New York Times. And in doing that, in Poughkeepsie, this crazy serial murder case was sort of in my backyard. I was living near Poughkeepsie. This serial murder case happened. I got completely obsessed by it. I wrote a book about it. In doing the book, which involved, communicating with this guy, this serial murderer, that was a really pivotal experience and really changed my life. It was also really daunting. It was really too much for me at the time. And I needed to change some things in my life. So I got in the car, I drove to Seattle. I stepped away from the serial killer
you could
book.
have gone further, couldn't you have? No, I'm just kidding. Yeah.
Couldn't have gone any
Yeah.
further
Right.
except for Alaska, I guess.
Yeah, right.
Uh, Went to Seattle, didn't really know what I was going to do, was still trying to wrestle with this book. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer, a fantastic newspaper that no longer exists, said, why don't you just come here and be a social issues reporter? I said, great. I put that book aside, unfinished business. Just too much for me. Worked there, worked at the PI for almost 6 years. That paper folded at that then, right then. And roughly around in there, I said, hey, what about that serial killer book? There really was something there that's called The Spider and the Fly. I went back to it. I finished it. I got it published. Um, Here we are, and then
Yeah.
I went to the Seattle Times. I was an education reporter. I found this story, and here we are.
Yeah, yeah. The just talking about the Riverdale Press, at one time it was a huge paper. I mean, they did a lot of great work, a couple of Pulitzer Prizes.
Yep.
It's much different than what it was now, and I only know that because my dad is probably the most. I mean, I don't want to do this, but he's one of the most, if not the most, prominent journalist in the Bronx. Just got inducted to the Bronx Walk of Fame. So the Riverdale Press has been a part of my life for since the beginning, 42 years now.
I could not have asked for a better start in journalism, I will say. And I say it all the time. I know it was very sort of unconventional because I didn't go to J school, but I didn't need to with those guys teaching me.
Yeah, yeah. Gosh, I forget the name now.
Buddy Stein and Richie
Buddy Stein, right.
Bernard
That was it.
Stein and Richie are brothers who
Yes,
took the paper from their dad, who had been a copy editor
right.
with the AP, and then they made it into what it became, and then they sold it to another outfit.
Yeah, I remember. Okay, anyway, we're off on an aside. Back to the topic at hand here. 400,000 kids are wards of the state. 20,000 a year age out and go straight into homelessness. What's not being done? What is not being grabbed onto here to say, wait a minute, we need some kind of middling force here to cushion this blow that these kids are taking?
There are a couple of things. I must say, it truly blows my mind that this state of affairs, this is not new, not a recent trend, not a sudden spike. the incarceration numbers, the homelessness numbers. This has been the case for a really long time. I cannot believe that there isn't widespread outcry about it. However, what's not happening? A couple things. I mentioned that we've learned a lot more about youth brain development in the last 20 years. One thing we have learned is the importance of what they call attachment or connection. And it's not just, oh, that's a nice thing. There's actual chemical, hormonal, biological responses to when attachment is sundered or gets off track in childhood. That has hormonal results within a person. So your cortisol, stress hormone cortisol, is way elevated. For all people, the stress hormone is elevated in the morning and it sort of dips down at night. And it's normal for it to have an up and down pattern. For kids who have undergone trauma, they could be in foster care or not, but for kids who have undergone trauma, that stress hormone is elevated, it stays elevated. And this affects ability to sleep, ability to concentrate in school, emotional resilience. So, and it stays, right? So for you and me, right, it affects resilience in the sense that all people deal with frustration, humiliation, boredom, sadness, all the stuff, right? Especially when you're a young adult, you're trying to make your way. But this elevated cortisol and its effects make you less able to sort of roll with the indignities of life. And you might say your boss is rude to you. Say you're 19 years old, you've aged out of foster care, you have some minimum wage job that you were lucky to get because you maybe do or don't have a high school diploma, but that's all you have. You certainly haven't gone to college. You have this minimum wage job and your boss gives you a shift that you don't like. Maybe you told your boss, I can't work that shift, and they gave it to you anyway. A normal sort of standard person with a conventional background might say, hey, I told you, or can we work this differently? A lot of kids in foster care, which is written in the book, this exact situation will just flip the table. They'll just leave. They'll just say, forget it, or something far more objectionable than forget it. And they just walk. This sort of willingness to kind of roll with the punches of life is much more difficult for them. So what do? We do things that encourage connection. I mentioned that foster care as a system, while it's aiming for permanence, the reality of the system is transience, impermanence. And within that transience, kids are not connected. So foster parents know that their kid that they're caring for is likely to just, they're not going to adopt. So that kid's going to be removed. And the foster parent might have maybe a day's warning, maybe a few hours. So they're not going to get that connected to the kid. They're not going to attach to that kid because they know that kid is moving. The kid knows it too. And the kid knows that they're a paycheck. Marianne knew she was money comes with her to the foster family. She represents a monthly check. The kids know that. This also impedes connection on their part. This lack of connection isn't merely a shame or sad. It has biological ramifications. So we need to retool the system to encourage connection. One way to do that is relatively new, even though it shouldn't be. It's called kinship care, and it's the practice of the state, instead of placing a child with a stranger, saying, hey, is there a relative, grandma, auntie, or uncle who can take this kid? That, of course, grandparents have always taken in their grandchildren when there's a problem or difficulty in the family. The difference is the government now is increasingly saying, okay, Granny, we'll give you that foster care stipend that we were going to give to a stranger. We'll give it to you so that, Granny, you're not draining your retirement savings trying to care for children that you never intended to parent, right? That's what's new. And Sixto Cancel, this activist that I mentioned, that's really been his push, essentially formalizing kinship care.
I want to hear a little bit more about the solutions because there's two more things that you mentioned as solutions. But the last question I want to ask just about the whole thing is, There's another number that dropped, that shocked me, which is that they have PTSD. If you're in the foster system, you have PTSD at twice the rate of Iraq veterans, which means that being a foster child is akin to living in a war zone in at least some respects. How do the success stories happen with all of the stuff that we've been covering here? Who are the kids and how do the kids who get out of this system and become what you're talking about, someone contributing to society? How does that happen?
It's frankly a rarity. It's in spite of the system. I mean, it is. I should point out the sort of bookend to this 59% incarceration number I keep saying. Fewer than 5% of kids who grow up in foster care ever get a 4-year college degree. 59% lockup, fewer than 5% with a bachelor's degree. Like, this is a known thing. So I mean, I will say states have recognized this and attempted to sort of mitigate that by saying, hey, you can be in extended foster care until you're 21 if you're in school or employed. But the problem is kids who grow up in the system, by the time they're 18, they were like me with school. They're like, no, I'm done, no more of the government in my business. And so understandably, they cut ties and there they are on the street. The other, so your question is, how do the ones who have become successes done so? From what I can tell, in every case I can think of, pretty much, there is some moment of connection with a stable, responsible, trustworthy adult. It might be a teacher. There's a story in the book about this kid, Jay, who was a foster kid in New York City, gang involved, growing up in group homes, trudging around the city with his stuff in a garbage bag. At his 4th high school, he's been through 3, dropped out or expelled, lands at his 4th high school. This student advocate sort of meets up with him. He's on her caseload, her only job. She's 23 years old. It's her own first job out of college. She's a kid herself. Her job is get these students over the line to graduation, whatever it takes. Work with their teachers, work with their after school jobs, whatever it is, get them to graduate. She meets this kid, Jay. She realizes the main reason he doesn't come to school is because he's afraid, because he's always looking out for some rival gang set that's going to jump him. So their primary work together is this woman, Anna, working with Jay on Google Maps to find different routes to school so that he varies his path to school. This is their connection. They only work together for 9 months, right? It's not a huge amount of time, and she's not this seasoned professional. She's 23. But I saw Jay 2 months ago earn his PhD. I mean, this is a kid nobody thought was going to graduate high school. 10 years later, he just got a PhD from John Jay School of Criminal Justice in New York City. I watched him defend his dissertation and be made a doctor. And he pegs it to the moment back at the last chance high school with this student advocate. This is what I mean. It's not some huge thing that requires, graduate degrees and great training. It was a moment of connection. It sent him on the path. And I'm not saying it's a miracle. It's going to be hard. Not every kid is ready for that when you're ready to give it. But when it works, it can have a life-changing effect.
There are 2 other solutions that you mentioned, at least 2, but 2 we'll cover here. One is called the Quality Parenting Initiative. What is that?
It's also around improving connections for foster youth, but it works on the other side of the system. It works with foster parents. And it says, hey, the system's not so great for them either. The brand of foster parent is sort of corrupted. Everyone thinks, oh, they're just in it for the money, right? Or they're abusers or whatever. So QPI, Quality Parenting Initiative, is aimed to better recruit, train, and match foster parent to foster kid. It's not just, oh, you're a random way station with an open bed. We'll just plunk whatever kid in there. No, it's supposed to be, you're a good match for this kid, and you you, the new foster parent, we want you to have a connection with the child's biological family. This is very risky, and this is why states go, we don't know if we like this, because often the biological family is so angry, so dysfunctional. They don't want any connection to the person who, represents this force, this system, the government that took their kid, right? But it's better for the kid if there can be a connection between the foster parent and the biological parent. So, like Florida passed a law saying there has to be some sort of phone conversation in the first night, or ideally, but maybe even in the first week, where it's also that the child understands, hey, you're not some random person floating through the system with no ties to anyone. We see you. We get you. We're around you. That's what Quality Parenting Initiative is. The third thing is JR to
Yeah.
25, right?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
what is juvenile rehabilitation to 25?
Juvenile rehabilitation to 25 is not specifically about foster care, but what it is about juvenile justice, youth crime. But what it did was sort of shine a light on foster care for me. JR to 25 is a law that Washington State passed, and there are just a few other states, that maybe a half dozen, that have done something similar. And what it says is, if you are a minor, like Marianne at the beginning of my book, who was 16 when she shot and killed this man, she was charged as an adult because of her age and the seriousness of the crime. JR to 25 says, if you're that kid, if you're a minor who is charged as an adult, instead of putting you in state prison when you're 18, we're going to keep you in a youth facility until you're 25. The thinking being a youth facility, even though it's a prison, it's a locked up, still, youth facility is supposedly more focused on education, therapy, leadership development, all this, all counseling, all this stuff. And the idea is, because we know that young people's brains are still forming until they are 25, and that has been stipulated by the courts, the US Supreme Court. This is settled law. Your brain is forming. If you're in a state prison, that's what it's going to absorb, that environment. If you're in this more supposedly rehabilitative environment, that's what you'll absorb. And so that's what we're hoping for. In the case of Marianne, so Marianne was the part of the first cohort of young people who were eligible for this in Washington State. And I was very skeptical, I will say right out. I thought, not because I thought Marianne was so broken, but because I doubted whether a government system, sort of bare bones staff, was really going to be able to really deliver. But Marianne was there for 4 years. It's called the Echo Glen Children's Center. And she was there when she was 20 years old, 20 to 24. She did not like the name. She did not like being at a children's center. But there was a notable change in her during that time, and it surprised me. And it wasn't because JR to 25 is so fantastic. It's a good concept. I mean, the theory of brain development and sort of sucking up what's around you, that makes sense. It was a bare bones system. It wasn't fantastic, but it was the first real stability that she had ever known. It was the first time Marianne kind of, except for her brief and fraught 2-year adoption, which was not great. Other than that, it was the first time in her life that Marianne knew that she'd be safe. No one was going to jump her. She knew where she'd be fed. She knew when she'd be fed. She knew the adults who were sort of managing her. They weren't going to change month to month like social workers and lawyers do. They just change. There was going to be stability. That's what was so important to me, because the change in her was not that Echo Glen or JR to 25 were so rehabilitative, though they were. It was how that a prison was better than foster care. This was the point of putting JR to 25 in the book. It affected a huge change in her, and it was better than foster care.
As we just wrap things up here, what advice do you have for media who are inspired to cover the foster system?
That's a really great question. It is difficult, as I said, because most people in it are minors. And so privacy, confidentiality, all of that is difficult. Also, children who are really children is difficult for them to articulate what's happening for them. So if you're a reporter and you're going to be reporting on foster care, you're mostly going to be working with the adults and foster parents if they will talk to you. But it is difficult. You're going to have to, it is truly difficult. I think it's a tough nut. I think the number one thing is don't expect to be bombing in on sort of like a breaking news schedule and, oh, this happened and this kid died and I'm going to get the story. You're going to get a story, but this is the kind of stuff that is very difficult to do on a breaking news deadline. You really can't. These kinds of stories are system stories. They take a long time. I guess I would say to any editors who might be listening, understand that they take a long time. Give your reporters time to get in there. I mean, different newsrooms are able to do it at different levels, but that's the first thing. Don't expect that bombing in on a breaking news situation is going to give you the meaty story. It's not.
What do you hope the impact of this book is?
I want general readers. This book is, while people who know the system and work in the system or touch the system have embraced the book, and I'm gratified for it. I'm really glad about that. But I wrote the book for general readers who don't know anything about foster care. I wrote it to be immersive and engaging. I wrote it to feel at points like a novel, even though everything is true. I really wanted it. I want a general reader to see these kids who are invisible most of the time, except if they end up in a court case, right? Or in in the newspaper for some other reason. I want a general reader to understand what is going on. What is that experience of being moved around and always being the new kid? What does it feel like? How does it make you act? That's what I hope the impact of this book is.
Your dedication is so simple to the kids. How much did you wrestle with that?
Oh, you mean like in the front of the
Yeah,
book, my
literally the
dedication?
dedication. Yeah.
I think I said for all the kids.
For
Yeah.
all the kids or to the kids. Yeah.
I did wrestle. I mean, there are certainly people in my life who have been
Who deserve it.
foundational. But I did this book for the kids. This is why the people in the book who spoke to me, this is why they spoke to me, for all the kids coming behind them who they'll never know. This is for the kids.
Yeah. And have you decided what might be next?
Well, I have some thoughts. One thing in doing this book and going so deep on US foster care, it made me wonder a great deal about other countries. Other countries also have versions of foster care. My impression is that some of them do have much better outcomes than we do. Our outcomes are not good. Homelessness and incarceration are the primary outcomes of foster care in the US. I would like to know what is going on in other countries. Do they have better outcomes? I believe some do. And one of the sort of solutions in the book, which we didn't get to, comes from the UK. That's that Chelsea Foyer model in New York City, which is essentially assisted living for young adults.
Claudia Rowe, the author of Words of the State, The Long Shadow of American Foster Care. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great to talk with you.
Check out the book, also her website, ClaudiaRoweJournalist.com. She's on the website formerly known as Twitter at RoweReport.com. AxelbankHistory.com was designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. It has our most recent episodes on it, featured episodes, and also a link to our Patreon page. So check her work out. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.